Yes, welcome to this lecture. I work at the Faculty of Law of the University of Groningen, but I feel very connected to both the University of Groningen and Utrecht University because I did my PhD and I also studied in Utrecht. And now I work at the Faculty of Law in Groningen, and I have various affiliations, including founding member of a research center called Global Health Law Groningen, and I'm also actively involved with the Aletta Jacob School of Public Health. So let's see, let's move to the next slide. I'm going to talk about the current crisis in light of international law and human rights. And I'll give an introduction soon, but I'm going to talk about two parallel regimes. So on the one hand, the regime of the World Health Organization that is very important in the current crisis, and specifically the international health regulations. And in that context, the role of the World Health Organization. And the other regime that I'm going to talk about is human rights law. So I'm going to talk about the human rights regime of the United Nations and a bit about its origins and nature, the standards, and also again the implications at the domestic level. Now, I don't know if it's visible for you, but I have a little icon here to the right. Can you see it? Yes, it's a chat icon, and I'm using this icon every now and then throughout the slides to ask you a question so that you can respond. But of course, we will also create opportunities for you to ask questions. But for now, can I just test this system and ask you a first question? Where are you from? Because I think it's interesting to know where you're from and also to be able to relate to that a little bit. So can you type in your country of origin, just to have a little bit of a flavor of what we have in the room this evening?
Wow, and I'm not sure if you can see the chat, but it's coming in. We are represented by people from all over the world. Can
you mention just a few countries to me?
Yeah, so the Netherlands, of course, Groningen, Utrecht, Romania, Greece, Brazil, another person from Brazil, Croatia, Russia, Friesland as a special within the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, Iraq, Suriname, Siberia, Saudi Arabia, Bedouin in Turkey, I presume, Cyprus.
Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody from all over the world. I can see I'm very impressed. I hope you are all well, and let's continue our lecture. So today is Liberation Day in the Netherlands. If I look outside, I see the flag of my neighbor. We celebrate the fact that on the 5th of May 1945, we were freed from the Nazi regime, which was a very important historic moment in time. And at the time, it was, of course, the end of a crisis. And today we are again in a crisis, of course, a completely different crisis. But also in this particular crisis, the crisis that we are in now, human rights play a vital role. And I'm going to talk about that later in my lecture. Now, the end of the Second World War, the period after 1945, marked a time of rebuilding the nation, the Netherlands and other countries after a period of crisis. And you can say it was also a time of idealism and a time of optimism. And in that spirit, World Health Organization was established, and also human rights mechanisms were established. And the human rights mechanisms were also especially established as in a way as a response to the atrocities committed during the Second World War, and with the idea that such atrocities should not be happen again, and that mechanisms should be adopted to protect us, societies, from such horrendous forms of state abuse. Now, but I wanted to start with that first regime, right? That regime of the World Health Organization that is also so important for infectious disease control. And but let's first talk about how this started, this World Health Organization. There was already in 1945, in that spirit of optimism, a conference in San Francisco. And of course, there was much debate, but there was, for example, one memorandum from Archbishop Spellman. You see him on the slide to the right. And in that memorandum, and I think that's interesting, he said, medicine is one of the pillars of peace. So clearly establishing the link between medicine between health, if you like, and peace. I thought that was an interesting notion. And at that conference, the idea of a World Health Organization was formally adopted. And 1 year later, WHO was more or less established, and it formally became active as from 1948. Now, and in 1948, that is then also when the founding document of the World Health Organization entered into force, became law. And that is the Constitution of the World Health Organization. And it's a really important document. It's such an important document because it is of great inspiration to human rights as well. Let me show you that in a second. But what it also does in its preamble, in the beginning text, is that it gives a definition of health. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Now, this is a very interesting definition. It has been criticized frequently for being too absolute, for guaranteeing something that can never be guaranteed by a state, complete health. I mean, if we feel that way 1 second a day, that's already fantastic, isn't it? But at the same time, there's a lot of goodness in that text. It's a very holistic definition in the sense that it doesn't talk only about absence of disease or physical health, but it also mentions clearly mental and social well-being. So that's the strength of the definition, I think. What the Constitution also did was recognizing health as a human right, the right to the highest attainable standard of health. I'll come back to that later in my lecture, but that's very important. And this phrase clearly inspired the human rights treaties that were adopted in the decennia afterwards. Now, and important for infectious disease control was that in the Constitution was also a basis for adopting regulations and conventions. So in the Constitution, it says that World Health Organization can adopt regulations and conventions. What is at the same time extremely disappointing is that over the past 70 years, World Health Organization has adopted very little law, to the extent that there's only 3 binding instruments. The most important convention, there's only one convention, I should say, is the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. I've done a lot of research in that field, but that's of course not the topic of today. And the other regulation, which is very similar to a convention, because it's also binding, although states have not formally endorsed it, are the international health regulations, focusing on infectious disease control. Let me zoom in on that a bit more. So these international health regulations that are in force since 2007, so they were adopted in 2005, can be traced back to similar health regulations from the past. And what you see is that countries have collaborated in the field of infectious disease control since the 1850s already. So for more than 150 years, countries have already been collaborating in that field. Also because they saw that, diseases spread across borders. So there's clearly a need to agree on things in that context. So since 1903, we've had international sanitary regulations. And since the World Health Organization is in force since 1948, we've had 3 sets of these regulations in 1951, 1969, and in 2005. So these new international health regulations, again, are in force since 2007. And since then, we've had a range of emergencies. For example, Ebola in West Africa, 2014, a very important one. We've also had Zika in South America, 2016, which you would also remember. And now COVID-19 in China. So this is an important regime. That regime of the international health regulations is functions as such, in the sense that it takes a very broad approach, contrary to the previous regulations. So this new instrument, these new international health regulations, take an all hazards approach. All threats to public health are addressed by these health regulations. whereas the previous ones only addressed a limited set of diseases. And in addition to that, it's a huge, very long document, but I want to flag a few things that are important in this instrument and are also relevant for the current crisis. Firstly, the idea of core capacities. And I think this is very interesting also for people with a medical background, because it talks about what your health system should look like, how it should be equipped in order to address an infectious disease outbreak. So requirements regarding the public health infrastructure. There should be a capacity to detect, assess, notify, and report. I think this is interesting. And if you Google WHO Europe and then core capacity, you will see a website where you see how countries across Europe perform. And it shows that European countries perform really well. And there you may ask yourself questions, because we've seen all these shortages in the corona crisis, haven't we? Shortages in terms of medical equipment, ICU beds, masks, gloves, medicines, and so on. That makes you wonder. So I think this is something to research further. There's another website from an organization called JEE that you may wish to look at. That's an independent US organization that independently investigates how countries comply with the core capacities. And maybe their findings are a bit more critical. Another important condition in the health regulations is that members are to notify within 24 hours the World Health Organization in case they detect what they think is an emergency. And then WHO will research that outbreak and can declare that there is a public health emergency of international concern. And then it can issue temporary recommendations to the country concerned, and then there will be this collaboration between this country and the World Health Organization. It's all very much focused on collaboration, right? So there's no sanctions in the international health regulations, no naming and shaming. And that's something that's up for debate, of course, also in the current corona crisis. Because we are also seeing that the current corona crisis is becoming a little bit of a political crisis. For example, the criticism is that the World Health Organization, China took more than 24 hours to report to the World Health Organization about the outbreak of the disease, right? It took a few weeks in December. At the same time, if you compare this situation with Ebola in West Africa, for example, this is a lot faster, and the whole collaboration and also the response from World Health Organization was a lot more effective. So yeah, there is, of course, the criticism from our US President Trump to this whole situation. Trump has maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago withdrawn US funding to the World Health Organization. US contributes around $220 million each year, and it has now suspended that funding. And yeah, I think that's very disappointing. And the US is the largest funder, so this is something to discuss. And what we should also discuss perhaps is the fact that there's no sanction mechanisms within the framework of the World Health Organization. Whether that's disappointing, I would argue that this collaboration is very important. But this is a moment where I would like to invite you maybe to respond a bit and to ask a question if you like.
I don't see any questions in the chat now. For everyone, you're very much welcome to ask questions if you prefer. Oh, there is a question from Daniela.
Is everything clear so far?
Oh, the questions are coming in now. I need to see. Okay, it's a search to find everyone individually. Daniela If you allow me, I will ask your question for you. Do you as an expert consider the reaction of the WHO as adequate? And I presume, yeah, that's a question to you.
I would say that the World Health Organization is an incredibly important organization with an incredible amount of expertise. And not everything they do is perfect, but it is the best we have. And it should be improved, and it should firstly receive a lot more funding from states. A lot of the money that they receive is also donated privately. That is a good thing. But as a result of that, a lot of that money is earmarked. And what we want is funding from states that can be spent freely by WHO. I think it's a very important organization that we should all support. And I'm confused about this idea of naming and shaming and sanctioning, and whether the international health regulations should embrace that or have that, or whether they should be modified in that way. I'm also afraid that you scare countries with those kind of mechanisms, and that the collaboration is extremely important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall I continue?
There are a few more questions, but because of time and we only have an hour, maybe continue, and for the next time block we will also have an opportunity to.
Sure. And you know, if you have a question afterwards, if it's brief, you can also email me. So you know, there's also some students from the Netherlands in the room, I'm sure. And so what does this national legislation in the field look like? So in the Netherlands, we have implemented the international health regulations through the Wet Publieke Gezondheid, the Public Health Act. And based on that act, COVID-19 is qualified as a so-called A-type disease. As a result of that, very drastic measures can be imposed. And we have safety regions in the Netherlands that can then adopt certain emergency regulations that provide a basis for enforcement. So there is clearly certain enforcement and sanction mechanisms in the Netherlands. And these are also questions of human rights, because how far do you go in taking your measures, right? And I'll come back to that later. But I first wanted to show this as a mechanism, and also to indicate that this mechanism is intertwined with human rights law. And this is also where international health regulations and human rights come together. But that brings me to human rights law. And I think this is an extremely important regime in any crisis, but also in a situation where there's no crisis. And I think it's really important to start a little bit at the beginning of human rights. Don't worry, it won't take too long, but I think there's quite sometimes talk about human rights without really understanding what we are talking about. It's clear that human rights, in the way we know them today, have been adopted since the Second World War. But they are also an evolutionary phenomenon that has matured over time. And there's a lot of interesting references to human rights throughout history. To give you one perhaps odd example, in the Greek tragedy Antigone, there's an interesting reference to human rights in the sense that Antigone wants to bury one of her brothers. So both brothers have killed each other in a fight, and one of the two brothers was against the king, her uncle, and Antigone goes against the laws of her uncle and invokes a higher law, the laws of the gods, to be entitled to bury her brothers. So this tension between a national law and a higher law is what we also see in the Greek tragedy Antigone. Now, what's also important to know in relation to human rights is that we have, in fact, three types of human rights. And sometimes we call them generations of human rights. And the interesting thing about the term generations is that it shows how human rights, different types of human rights, can be traced back to different times in history. Although at the same time, this term generations is a little bit outdated, because we now sort of all agree, at least at the level of the United Nations, that all these human rights are interrelated and that they reinforce each other. But okay, the first generation of human rights is civil and political rights. And civil and political rights can be traced back to the Age of Enlightenment. And the Age of Enlightenment around 1800 is clearly a time where philosophers like Locke and Hobbes talked about the social contracts and this idea that those who are in power should do something in exchange for that power. And again, also that idea of natural rights, rights that we have simply because we are human beings. So that's the Age of Enlightenment and civil and political rights. Then the second type of human rights are the so-called economic, social, and cultural rights that can be traced back to Industrial Revolution, so the 19th century. And that was a time of unprecedented growth, but at the same time also harsh working conditions, child labor, poor living conditions, infectious diseases like cholera. And that triggered the coming to existence of the establishment of social rights. So a social rights movement came to existence, and as such also the broader thinking about economic, social, and cultural rights in the way we know them today. The third category of rights that I wanted to mention here are the so-called collective rights. So these are rights that we own as a collectivity. So not so much as an individual as with the first two categories of rights, but rights that we own as a collectivity. And those rights can be traced back to the era of decolonization from the 1950s, because that was a time where the colonized peoples claimed their independence. So they claimed their collective right to self-determination. These collective rights, I would argue, are also very important today in an era of environmental degradation, in an era of climate change. This is where we as a collectivity, as a people, want to claim these kind of collective rights. I have a little chat moment here on the screen because I wanted to ask you, maybe you can give an example of what you think is an economic and social rights, very briefly. And we'll come back to these rights later. Let me give you myself examples of civil and political rights are, for example, the right to life, freedom of expression, the right to a fair trial. But can you give an example of an economic and social right? And maybe an economic and social right that is important in the current crisis. What do you think? Is somebody already typing something, Joyce?
Elena says right to health, Daniela right to work, vacation days, someone mentions. Those are the...
This is perfect.
Oh, free trade, housing, another housing.
Sorry?
Free trade and housing are also mentioned. And there are two questions for you too. So that's also good to know.
Okay. Do you want me to continue, or do you want me to address these questions?
I think these two questions are very much linked because they talk about accountability mechanisms.
Right.
I'm now trying to...
Shall I come back to that later? Because it's later in my lecture that I will talk briefly about that.
Yes, yeah? Perfect. Thank you.
Right, so we have these three types of rights, but again, this Second World War is so important for the origins of human rights. And here you see Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the former president of the US. She became involved in the adoption of the first international human rights instrument, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that was adopted in 1948. And it's a very comprehensive document and adopted again very much in response to the atrocities committed during the Second World War. So it contains many rights. I can recommend you to have a look at it and just to see what types of rights are in there. And since then, standard setting started. So here you see the most important human rights treaties adopted within the framework of the United Nations. And the first two treaties go back to this distinction between civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. And the fact that these two treaties were adopted separately has to do with the Cold War, because no agreement could be reached on which rights were more important. So the East stressed the importance of economic, social, and cultural rights, former USSR, whereas the United States emphasized very much the civil and political human rights. And up till today, and this is perhaps interesting to mention also in the current COVID crisis, China is not a party to, not a formal party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and as a result of that doesn't recognize at least the rights in that particular treaty. And the US is not a party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and as such it doesn't recognize the right to health in that treaty, for example. But on this list you see a number of thematic treaties, focusing on racial discrimination, torture and forced disappearances. And you also see treaties protecting a particular vulnerable group in society: women, children, migrant workers, disabilities. And you can say that a treaty on disabilities is very important in the current crisis, right? We have a disability treaty, and that's important because disabled persons are very vulnerable in the current crisis. What we do not have, as you can see on the list, is a treaty protecting the rights of older persons. And there's actually debate about whether such a treaty should be adopted. And actually, I attended a meeting last fall in Geneva discussing the possibility of such a treaty, which I think is a very interesting development. We have similar treaties at the regional level. For example, within the framework of the Council of Europe, in Europe, we have similar treaties, but we also have them in the Americas and in Africa. Unfortunately, we don't have them yet in Asia. And in connection to these treaties, there are so-called monitoring mechanisms for states to show that they comply with these treaties. And these can be human rights courts, although we have very few human rights courts, complaint bodies, reporting procedures, special rapporteurs, for example. And when it comes to these courts, you can first go to your national court if you think your human rights have been violated. And after what they call exhaustion of local remedies, when you're done at the national level, you can go to a human rights court. For example, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. But that's a long path, of course. Now, I want to say also something about what are human rights. And I want to mention 4 key features of human rights. Firstly, this notion of human dignity. We can say that the whole body of human rights is aimed at protecting our human dignity as human beings. We have this dignity simply because we are human beings. Whether we are a doctor, whether we are a criminal, whether we are a criminal doctor, we all have human dignity that needs to be protected. And this dignity translates into rights, rights that we all have, as right holders. And I mention here some rights that are of particular importance in the COVID crisis. Rights to privacy, physical integrity, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, right to health, right to education. And you can already see civil and political rights, economic, social and cultural rights are all important in this crisis. And states have to guarantee our rights. That's what it's all about, right? States have legal obligations to guarantee our rights. And there you see that idea of a social contract appearing again. They have negative obligations in the sense that they should respect our freedom of expression, for example. And they have positive obligations in the sense that they should take action to guarantee, for example, our access to healthcare facilities. And my 4th point is that a key principle underlying the whole body of human rights law is this principle of non-discrimination. And the fact that human rights are very much designed to protect those who are vulnerable in society. Now, very briefly, the American Declaration of Independence is a beautiful document, I think, that was adopted in 1776 because it talks about all these things that are so important in human rights. Inalienable rights, rights that we have simply because we are human beings. Governments have to guarantee our rights, and it's about the consent of the governed. But of course, the main analysis is about human rights in the time of Corona. And here you see that both economic, social and cultural rights and civil and political rights are important in this crisis. And I've marked the right to health in red because I think it's the key right in this crisis. And it is very much what we see in this crisis. On the one hand, governments are trying their utmost to realize, to guarantee the right to health. But that sometimes goes to the detriment of other rights. For example, the right to education. Because when schools are closed, to secure public health that impacts on access to education for children, for example. And measures taken to protect health may also affect our freedom of movement, our right to privacy, right? So it's about balancing these rights. And in particular, then asking ourselves, how far should we go in guaranteeing the right to health? I'm going to skip that slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about this right to health, because that's the key in our analysis. And what's a really very important component in the right to health is the so-called AAAQ. And you find that in General Comment 14. It was uploaded as one of the instruments that you were able to read in preparation of this lecture. And the AAAQ says that governments need to guarantee the availability, the accessibility, the acceptability, and the quality of all health-related services. So maybe it can also be linked a bit to this requirement of core capacities of the state. What does this AAAQ mean in relation to COVID-19? What are states supposed to do? They are supposed to guarantee that medical equipment is available to a sufficient amount, right? And health services should also be affordable, and there should be this geographic spread of healthcare services. I would love to discuss this more elaborately with you, but unfortunately there is not sufficient time. What I would also like to indicate, because I think this is really important, is this idea of suspension of civil and political rights. Think about freedom of movement. How far do we go in limiting freedom of movement? And you can see that there's two suspension models, if you like. There's suspension light, and that is what we have more or less adopted in the Netherlands, is where for each individual right, we determine how far we go in limiting the rights. And then the principle of proportionality plays an important role. Does the severity of the measure justify the public health problem? So that's what we do in the Netherlands, a constant balancing of how far we should go in limiting human rights to freedom of movement, right to privacy, and so on. The more drastic model is where you derogate from rights. And that's what around 15 countries in Europe have more or less adopted. And it means that you set aside rights completely for everyone in society. So right to privacy, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, right? And some rights remain intact, including right to life, prohibition of torture, but the other rights can be set aside completely. That's something to follow very closely. Think about freedom of expression and the idea that states can set aside freedom of expression. It is very important that healthcare providers, journalists, and so on can express their concerns. And if they are not able to do so, then that is disconcerting. So it's something to follow and to monitor closely. I've talked so far very much about the human rights responsibilities of governments, but we may also ask ourselves, do we have human rights responsibilities, society at large and other actors in society? And there is a beautiful basis for that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that every individual and every organ of society has human rights responsibilities. Now, the question is, of course, what do these human rights responsibilities look like? Maybe we can brainstorm a little bit about that. Would you like to respond to this? Or maybe to some of the other things that I've discussed so far? I realize I've maybe gone a bit fast through the slides, but let's pause a little bit and see if there's some questions here.
Maybe the question of Eloisa to start. I'm checking. Eloisa, I'm giving you speaking privileges. Can you please elaborate on your question?
Yes, I was wondering, because you listed a series of treaties that guarantees rights for specific target groups, such as people with disabilities or women. and you were discussing the possibility of starting a treaty that was guaranteeing specifically older people. I was wondering if this is effective as way of dealing with human rights, because intuitively, every time I think about human rights, I think if those rights are guaranteed to humans as such, then there shouldn't be the need of making treaties that target specific categories, but an old person, for example, should be already be protected just for the fact of being a human. I don't know if it's clear. It's just something I always think about when I read about treaties.
It's a very interesting question, and it's a very good question as well. You say in a way, you know, why don't we just have generic treaties protecting everyone in society? At the same time, these specific treaties can also protect something specific. For example, if you look at CEDAW, the Women's Rights Treaty, you see, for example, a provision on reproductive health rights. And that's, of course, very important. And if you go to the Children's Rights Convention, by the way, that's the most widely ratified treaty around the world, so a very authoritative treaty. You see there the protection of the best interest of the child, so that specific emphasis on the vulnerability of children. I would say it's important, but the idea of a treaty protecting the rights of older persons is controversial. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. We have about 20 more minutes. I'm not sure where you're in your whole lecture. Would you like to continue, or is there time for one more question?
Yes, then it's time for one more question. I thought we had less, but you want to continue until 8?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let's see. There are a few outstanding questions. I think T's questions. I'm not sure what your full first name is, but T had a question about derogation. I'm going to see if I can unmute you. I think you may have just, oh, there you are. Okay, T, would you like to ask your question? Or maybe he just, or she just said, oh, Bianca, you also just asked a question linked to, I think, what was also discussed just now. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
So I was thinking, you talked about freedom of speech as a human rights freedom. But now in terms of coronavirus, we have seen a lot of like conspiracy theories coming up, like the 5G, or a lot of fake news about the coronavirus situation. What is your opinion regarding this freedom of speech in times of corona? Because it can also harm efforts that governments are doing, such as social isolation, if people start believing those things. And for example, Twitter and Facebook, they started already like banning like misleading information or fake news. So yeah, I was just wondering.
Yeah, that's another great question. So if you allow unlimited freedom of speech, there will be a lot of fake news that can also harm people, right? And you're saying that you are maybe worried about that, and I agree with you. So on the one hand, it's this governmental duty, I would say, to ensure that there's no false information about the disease, and at the same time there is this obligation to guarantee freedom of speech in a way that people who have certain professional roles, for example, or patients, can express their concerns. But I realize that this is difficult. Yeah, that's a good point. Any further questions?
Thank you for answering my question.
There were the two outstanding questions about accountability. Is that still going to be discussed in a minute, or should we invite?
Yeah, I have a slide on accountability more towards the end. So.
Okay, we'll just hold off. If you can continue, then we keep the other questions for until the end.
So yes, so this is where I was. So I talked about the responsibilities of society at large. On the one hand, governments have legal obligations to guarantee our rights. but there's also a broader debate as to what are the responsibilities of maybe us as well as a society. It's maybe also a call, this whole crisis, on our solidarity, right, to each other. So I think this basis in the Universal Declaration is interesting in that sense. Then we can also make an analysis of COVID-19 in the Netherlands. And we have, now again, both economic, social and cultural rights, and we have civil and political rights. And if I may make a very superficial analysis, then allow me to do so on a point-by-point basis. For example, in relation to the right to health, we can ask ourselves, did our government, the Dutch government, for example, respond too late to the crisis, right? Is there sufficient care for corona patients? That's also a question of the right to health. Is there a lack of equipment? And what's not on the slide, but what I could add here is generic care. That to what extent is general care still sufficiently available across the country? So these are all questions that you can ask yourself from the perspective of the right to health. From the perspective of the right to education, we can talk about access to schooling for children. And when it comes to civil and political rights, we can question, and this has also been done by some legal scholars in the Netherlands, these emergency directives and the role of the so-called super majors in the Netherlands. And does that set aside democratic oversight from parliament, from the local councils? We can talk about freedom of expression. We can talk about right to privacy and these special apps, for example. So these are all questions that we can ask ourselves. The crisis is a moving target. Everything changes every day, and I hesitate to make very clear pronouncements about where rights have been violated. We should also be a bit patient and understanding with our government that is in such a difficult situation. At the same time, we should follow these things closely and maybe afterwards evaluate where did we take the right decision and where did we go wrong. Perhaps maybe from the perspective of your country, you would also like to respond to this. So another moment maybe for people to briefly respond. It can also be in a written chat, just an observation, what you think is going on from the perspective of economic, social and cultural rights, civil and political rights, or even balancing these rights. If you read anything interesting, Joyce, that comes in, you may want to read it.
Elena is making the observation that there are so many varied approaches within the European Union country or European Union members. And she's wondering whether a more uniform approach via supranational structure might be better.
My brief answer is yes. I think we need more collaboration within the World Health Organization. We need more collaboration within the EU. I think it has become very clear that across the EU there was insufficient collaboration. And this crisis shows how important it is to collaborate. So it's a good point.
Yeah. Agatha sent me also a message. Agatha, would you like to elaborate on your comment? It links what you discussed with the real-life working context of medical doctors. Agatha, if you would like to speak, you can. Otherwise, I can also ask your question for you. Okay, so she indicates that medical doctors working in an ICU or hospital have the same rights, especially to health, as everyone has. When can you, as a doctor, refuse to work in a hot zone to ensure your right to health is being respected?
Wow. Well, let first, your question is interesting, and we can ask ourselves, what is the position of doctors from the perspective of human rights? I think they can also be seen as a vulnerable group in that sense, that needs protection, because they work on the front lines, they're exposed to the disease. So that's something to be very aware of. Can they refuse their work? Well, I'm not sure if that is a question of international human rights. It's more even a contractual question, and it's a question of you have your Hippocratic oath, don't you? So you have a duty of care to give care, and can you refuse that? I'm not entirely sure.
Your answer also answers a question from Ulf, who asked about whether doctors should be in a position to report directly to WHO, but your explanation on what is the level of accountability and enforcement and the contract, with who do you have a contract, I think covers this question too. But
I think it's very important that doctors should be able to speak out and speak freely about their concerns, and that society and government allows them to speak out. So that's a really vital condition in such a crisis, I think. They should be given a voice.
Yeah, and and to link it back to the question you posed to the participants, Lotte, Peter and Roos shared their thoughts. Lotte indicates that cultures and people in Europe are different, and that makes a single approach probably means impossible. So how do we take context into account also to make sure it's feasible to do in different countries? Peter observes that in the Netherlands there was or is an unjustified inequity or inequality between hospital care and elderly care, where the weak were not protected. And Roos Jonge observes how weird it is actually that we have borders again between the Netherlands and Belgium in this new world.
Well, I think all your observations and questions show how much human rights are implicated in this crisis, and that it's really important to talk about how human rights come into play here and whether they are violated or not. And I agree also with one of the commentators that indeed people in care homes are among the most vulnerable in this crisis, and that is maybe something we at the start have underestimated. I talked about the responsibilities of everyone in society, and if we talk about the responsibility of everyone in society, every actor in society, I should say, then we may also wish to speak about the responsibilities of non-state actors like multinational corporations, and corporations that are very important in this particular crisis are of course the pharmaceutical industry. Because they have a really important role to play in developing medicines, developing a vaccine in this crisis. And so what does human rights law have to say about what are the responsibilities of the pharmaceutical industry as a multinational corporation? Now, you should know that formally, only states are bound by these human rights treaties. So only states are formally bound by the treaties and have to realize the rights that are in there towards society. But it is now increasingly recognized that given the power and influence they exert over our health and well-being, corporations also have human rights responsibilities. So it is not so much said that they have legal obligations, but they have responsibilities towards society. And what is now recognized is that corporations, including the pharmaceutical industry, have a responsibility to respect human rights. So that's not a positive obligation to provide care, for example. No, it's only this negative obligation to refrain from violating human rights. And then you can ask yourself, of course, what does that mean for the pharmaceutical industry? Well, it can, in my view, mean something like being transparent about how you conduct your business. It would, in my view, also be a responsibility to be transparent about how the price of your product is composed. It would, in my view, also be a responsibility not to withhold essential information about drugs, about vaccines, for the sake of your own profit. This is really not a time where companies should go madly after their own profit. So that is a remark about the pharmaceutical industry and their human rights responsibilities. If you're interested in this responsibility to respect human rights, I encourage you to Google Ruggie principles, because these principles were adopted by the former UN Special Rapporteur on Business and Human Rights. Ruggie, yes. Now, and that is then the final slide about accountability. And yes, of course, I already indicated that in relation to all these human rights treaties, there are monitoring mechanisms, but we can also look more broadly into how does human rights law create accountability. Now, there are, broadly speaking, legal mechanisms and other mechanisms that you can look at and that you can use. So if you think your human rights have been violated, you can go to your domestic court with a human rights violation. And then after that, you may go to a regional court or a complaint body at the level of the United Nations. By the way, the United Nations doesn't have a human rights court. But you can also think of claims against the industry, for example, against the pharmaceutical industry. There you can go to your domestic court and you may start a criminal case. It could be a human rights case. There are possibilities there. But in addition to thinking about court cases and about this idea of naming and shaming, you could also think in terms of other mechanisms where you can seek justice, where you can address human rights violations. So my remark is actually also that when you want to achieve something in the field of human rights, you don't necessarily have to think about a court case or legal mechanism only. There's other fora where you can address human rights violations as well. You can go to parliament, you can go to an ombudsman potentially. Many countries have a national human rights institution. Many institutions like hospitals have complaint bodies. And then there's also non-governmental organizations that do very important work. And lastly, of course, there's also the media that play an important role. Now, when it comes to a legal court case, we've had, of course, in the Netherlands, a very important, the Urgenda court case, very important case in relation to climate change. That case, by the way, was also very clearly based on human rights. So that's an important example. I reached the point of questions and comments. So there's a little bit of time for further questions and comments. What I would like to say is, before we continue, every year we do a summer school, but this year we were unable to organize a summer school, so we've gone digital with this summer school. So there will be a few free modules online in July. So if you're interested in that, you're welcome to contact us. But let's go back to this. Your questions and comments, and we have a few more minutes for that, if I'm correct, Joyce.
Yes, we have about 5 more minutes. Marit was all the way one of the first people at the beginning of the lectures who had a question. Marit, would you like to ask your question? You're unmuted.
Yeah, I have a question about what happens if certain countries don't comply with the guidelines from the IHR, and can they be reprimanded? What will happen actually? Is there a legal obligation to follow them, these guidelines, or yeah, I'm
assuming you mean the international health regulations, right? The first regime that I talked about. So I talked about the international health regulations focusing on infectious disease control from the World Health Organization, and I talked about human rights. And for human rights, there's clearly all these mechanisms, right? You can also go to your court, but the international health regulations in principle do not provide for a sanctioning mechanism. So it's very much focused on collaboration between World Health Organization and the country where the outbreak takes place, and other countries where the outbreak spreads. So it's an important question, I think, whether there should be a sanction mechanism. And I'm sure that this will be hotly debated after this crisis.
Okay, yeah. And then I'm still wondering, what would be the incentive to collaborate then if there is no sanctioning for other countries?
Yeah, if I'm the head of a country, I would find it really important to control the spread of an infectious, dangerous disease, and I would like to have all the expertise on board that is possible, and I would then trust and rely on the World Health Organization to provide me with that expertise. But I'm not sure if all countries think that way.
Okay, thank you.
DCH, sorry, I don't know your full name. You only have your initials. You also had a question from the early start linked to accountability. Would you like to ask your question? You're unmuted.
Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah, I had a question about the funding. As you mentioned, it seems like the WHO is heavily relying on the charity for funding of certain countries. And wouldn't this introduce a big bias towards these countries?
Well, you mean that, for example, the US is by far the biggest funder of World Health Organization. Then does that cause a bias towards towards US? Is that your question?
Yes. So not only US, but also other countries, just in general. If you have a very, if you have an income stream that relies a lot on certain countries, then I could imagine that you would be very careful to rock the boat. Right.
Yes, well, frankly speaking, I'm not sure entirely how this works within the World Health Organization. We would have to ask them. I hope they are not biased. I hope they are still independent. It is my impression that the funding that comes from countries is in a way more neutral funding than funding that comes from these big donors, because that money is often earmarked. So.
Okay, well, thank you.
Nice, yeah. There, you also have a question, and we do have some time, so you can ask your question if you would like. I just unmuted you, so you can ask your question. It links to the funding topic that we're discussing now.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering how this very much ego-driven decision made by Trump will affect the WHO's current role, but also its future role in coordinating, for example, future pandemics and global problems in general.
Yes, I'm extremely worried about that. I'm worried that this will be detrimental to the authority of the World Health Organization. And so it may go into the wrong direction.
And might the other countries do something about it towards Trump? Because his decision is obviously made in the worst time possible. And is that just allowed to go without any punishment? I don't really know how to...
If I understand it correctly, it is allowed to withdraw your funding. But I think, it's a bit too soon to judge or to take. I mean, it's a bit too soon to decide where this is going to bring us. Mm-hmm. So it's an important question, but I hesitate to say anything very firm about it at this stage. But I'm extremely worried about World Health Organization being put in a negative light. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It is 8, but I do want to spend or give the floor to one last question because it links to the assignment that the COVID and Society students need to do later this week during their mock trial that will be led by Judy Fraser, who also joined. Hi, Judy. And it's about privacy and the current measurements that different governments are taking to limit possibly privacy laws. Who will make sure that the crisis measurements will be actually reduced again after the crisis, and data will not be collected beyond the purpose of what it was designed for in the corona outbreak at the moment?
Could you repeat that question, please?
So who is keeping governments accountable to ensure that we will not, that the privacy, possibly privacy infringing measurements that are being taken now by governments during this current pandemic, who is keeping governments accountable to make sure it's also downscaled again after the crisis is over?
Well, us as right holders, we should of course be very watch this very carefully and see where this is going. And we have a range of possibilities to complain, to submit complaints, to start court cases on the basis of our human rights that are set forth in the international treaties. I'm not a privacy expert, and especially also not on these apps. That also is a new phenomenon that we are now trying to follow. Yeah, I think it's something to follow very carefully. And there are, of course, also international human rights monitoring mechanisms where these issues could be addressed.
And for the students part of the COVID and Society course, this is what we will talk about on Thursday. So
great topic.
Yeah, it's and you just heard the warning. We are all the rights holders, so we should have an opinion about this. Okay, having said this, it's 8 o'clock. Thank you very much for joining us and giving this lecture. We will make the recording available through Studium Generale, the University Medical Center Groningen, and the University Medical Center Utrecht for all the students. And for now, I would like to point you towards the chat. There are lots of thank you notes coming in. And thank you again.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure, and I wish you lots of luck and good luck with your interesting course. And have a really nice evening.